This is going to be your major division between your anterior and your posterior. And now we're going to look, first we're going to look at some of these particular regions, particular sensory regions in the back of the brain here. So when we talked about those special sensories, right? We went over the ear a lot. And we said that, you know, it was being picked up, sensory things were being transduced into electrical signals. It's going to be sent into the brainstem and then into the thalamus, and it's going to be routed to a particular part of the brain. Your visual information is coming in, it's going to be sent to a particular part of your brain, right? Somatic, that is your body information, is going to be sent to a particular part of your brain. So again, at this point, all that stuff from the environment has been changed into electrical signals. It's been coded and it's being sent up to your brain. Your thalamus is going to filter it and relay it, but now it's ready for high level processing up in these particular regions, right? So the ones you want to know are these follows right here. Right? In your parietal lobe over here, I should have had this down, I'll write it. That sensory homunculus over here is kind of in this area of your brain, right? That's the parietal lobe. Your primary somatosensory cortex is right over here. That's somatic. Remember, somatic is basically the information you're getting from your skin and your limbs right there, right? The stuff you're conscious of. Whereas taste and everything, it's going to be buried in this other little section we didn't talk about underneath the cortex. It's going to be in your insula, right? So stuff that goes, the chemical stuff on your tongue goes in and it's dissolved and it's interpreted there as sweet and salty and all that stuff. Your visual information goes through here and goes all the way to the back of your brain. That's your insula, into your occipital lobe, right? And this is going to start analyzing all this visual information over here. And then your hearing, it's going to go in and end up in your temporal lobe over here for hearing, your primary auditory cortex, right? So these are, you know, mainly your parietal, your occipital, and your temporal, but there's a taste one as well. All right, so these are the main regions, right? This is where that information first goes after it leaves the thalamus, and it's going to be broken down into little bits and put back together. So for your vision, right? Again, remember that everything is going to cross over to the other side, but it comes in a little weird way. You have a left eye and a right eye, but you also, on each eye, you have a temporal region, right? On your temporal, like here's your ears, and then you have a nasal region on the inside right here. So when visual information is on the right visual field, it's going to come in from this spot and it's going to strike your right nasal region of your retina and your left temporal region of the retina. That's just the way it works, right? That's the way the light's going to come in, and it's going to go through the retina, I know, but just bear with me on this. From there, right, it's going to go back. Both of these, they're going to, this one, the right side is going to cross over and go to the left side of the brain, right? And whereas your temporal side, your left side, is actually going to go and be interpreted here, right? So the right visual field, not so much your right eyeball, is being interpreted by your left hemisphere. So this is a red dot here, but it'll be relevant kind of later. In your brain, everywhere in your brain has maps of whatever it's analyzing. So your occipital lobe, your primary occipital lobe, has a map of your visual field in it that's interpreting certain areas of your visual field. So if this is your visual field, if you're looking at this, by the time it gets to the back of the retina, the way the light is reflected in the signals and everything, it's a kind of reverse and upside down image of it. And then when it gets to the brain, it maybe flips over, who knows what it does, all sorts of weird things. But basically, there's going to be certain areas of the primary visual cortex dedicated to certain part of your visual field, right? And notice that this small area over here. The fovea, this is a part of your retina. That's your main area of focus right here. This 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are greatly enlarged, right? So we have a lot more analysis of whatever we happen to be focusing on in any one given moment. If you're focusing on something, you're paying attention to it and you want more analysis of it, right? And if you think about it right now, even though you kind of know what's going on in your periphery, there's a lot less detail than what you happen to be focusing on, right? So there's a lot more, there's a cortical magnification that is more neurons devoted to analyzing what's in your, whatever you're focusing on. That's called a cortical retinotopic map. That is, there's a map of your visual field in the back of this right here. Red dot, but keep that in mind. Auditory information coming in. We talked about this whole structure. Remember, this thing was vibrating over here because of the vibrations that were transduced through that mechanism. They set off these hair cells over here. The hair cells sent that electrical signal eventually through, and in a complicated way, brought them over to your auditory cortex. Okay, and they were interpreted there. Again, another red dot here, but it's interesting to think about, right? This was that basilar membrane that was vibrating up and down because the vibrations of the round window, right, was sending the fluid shock waves, and then the nerves were picking it up. And then that whole basal membrane had like different, it picked up different frequencies, right? It had like the base of the cochlea over here was very sensitive to high frequencies. The apex was very sensitive to low frequencies, which means that neurons, it was also mapped, kind of like your retinal field, right? So these guys at the base, there was the sensory cells, they would eventually route to this area and say, this is fire, this has a certain pattern of activity. These would be going over to this area, right? And everything in between, right? And all the complex stuff that's going on. But you need a map, right? Your brain needs to know exactly what neurons being fired to be able to interpret this. And if you were an evil scientist and you switch these around and someone was talking to you, everything would be all flipped in your head, right? If they kind of flip these wirings. So that's like a map of the sound in your head, right? The frequencies in your brain. All right, and then we already talked about this a little bit, right? Somatic sensations, that is all the touch receptors on the right side of your body, were being interpreted, we're being brought in by the sensory neurons. They were going up, relaying to that secondary neuron, crossing over, going to the thalamus, and then they were going over into your somatosensory cortex, right? So that, remember, these are all the neurons over here in your neocortex. Now you know what they are, right? The neocortex here. So you had a bunch of neocortex neurons over here analyzing what was going on in this patch of skin right here, are the proprioceptors, right? And again, if you were an evil scientist, if you stimulated this, the person would think, I feel something on my thumb right here, or you stimulated here, I feel something on my lips, on my tongue right here, right? So those neurons were responsible for, devoted to analyzing the information from that area of the body. And the magnification, why the hand is bigger than the back, is because we care a lot more what's happening in our hands and our lips and our tongue than we do on the back of our body and our trunk. We have many more receptors per square inch embedded within here. So we got a lot more information. So a lot more neurons are devoted to attending to it. So your brain area space takes up a lot more room devoted to your hand versus your back. That's another cortical magnification. And again, there's a point-to-point correspondence, right? If you trace this neuron back over here into the thalamus, right, that would be right next to the neurons that were devoted to this space. And if you went all the way down the spinal cord, all the way along, they would be like running along each other. So you have that maintenance of the map all the way through your body right there. The reason is really weird. It's a weird kind of thing, because you think, this stuff is projecting to your brain and And then your brain can kind of look at the sensory information and find out what's going on. But there's nobody looking at it, right? Your brain has to make sense to itself. So it's got to have that direct connection. And again, if I were to be an evil scientist and switch your shoulder neurons and put them over to your face, right? And I poked your shoulder, that neuron, you'd feel something in your face. Just like when people have if they have amputated limbs, the neurons that were over here were in a direct they were still active over here. If you poked them over there, they'd feel something in their thumb, even though they don't have a hand, because that's what your brain just thinks. In any case, that's the primary somatosensory cortex and the homunculus. All right, so back of the brain, posterior part of the brain, all sensory stuff. Somatosensory, that was that cortex here, your occipital lobe back here, your temporal lobe. Once that has that primary information in, that has that primary sensory input, it's going to send it over to adjacent areas. All right, so information comes in here, and then it's going to kind of be sent out for further processing in these association areas. Information coming in here is going to be sent out to these association areas. Sent out this way for further interpretation. Same thing with your auditory, right? Sent out over here. So it comes in, and then it's sent up toward these association areas for higher level processing. And this is where the really complex stuff goes on that we're not really going to get into, but this is where like really you're start to become very conscious of stuff, right? And start to build a picture of the world, which is what basically this back posterior part of your brain, right? Building a picture of the environment in which you can now bring into your other parts of the region so you can navigate in a sensible way within it. These are the association areas. Okay, and they're also going to like just this higher level perception, right? What's coming into your brain is one thing, right? You think about it. First of all, it's all electrical signals, but even that, right here, this is kind of higher order perception. Right here, this is a 1, 2, 3, 4 little Pac-Man shapes in the corner, and then 3 little triangles here without a base, right? But you put them in a certain way, and what you look at right here is you see this square. Reality, the square doesn't actually exist. You're almost also filling in stuff all the way right here, right? Because if you weren't trying to be tricked by psychiatrists, that's what that would be, a square that was blocking this shape right here, right? So your brain kind of immediately leaps out as there's a square right over here, a box covering this otherwise shape right here, right? Same thing with this. This is a 2-dimensional structure on paper, and they've drawn a couple of lines here, and the angles they drew it at was kind of tapping into your brain's way of sensing depth. So you see this sort of a 3-dimensional box over here, right? Even though if you didn't have that perception, it would just be a single, a couple of lines drawn in certain angles, right? So that's your brain kind of making sense of the world, right? In a normal pattern, right? So that's your kind of like from versus sensory information, just pure sensory information versus perception of stuff, right? Your brain's putting higher order structure on it. And two of the most highest order stuff we have in our brain is really language, right? Understanding language, understanding written or verbal, hearing words and stuff, and understanding what they mean, interpreting as language is going to be, one of these really higher order sensory areas. And if you notice, this Wernicke's area over here is in the back with all this sensory information. The Wernicke's area is kind of understanding language. Input into the language area comes from either visual or auditory or even tactile, right? If you were deaf, when you were reading Braille and stuff, that information would come in here. And it would enable you to kind of make it into symbolic and abstract symbols that would have you understand language. And that's all in the back of the brain right here. On the front of your brain, you have this other area called Broca's area over here. And that is going to be about producing speech, right? Actually generating, controlling all your speech generating apparatuses so you can actually make and tell, string together syntax and string together words and have your mouth sort of say them, or your hands, if you were using sign language, actually it would be that same area. So there was a congresswoman 5 or 10 years ago, assassination attempt, Gabby Giffords, she got shot, assassination attempt. She got, one of her areas she got hit was the Broca's area, and she couldn't talk, right? There was other problems with her, but she couldn't talk for like took a long time for her to regenerate her speech. And that was because this area over here it got damaged, right? And even if she could read, somehow she couldn't produce speech. So, it produces some very specific defects. Understanding language in Wernicke's area, and then speaking language, like generating speech in Broca's area. So this brings us into going from the sensory area to this motor area, because this generating speech is going to be in the front of the brain, and it's going to be about motor activity, like actually making activity.